Welcome to the Book Binge. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is going to be a little bit more of a unique review coming from me. Often when I have a review that is, comes off a little bit more mixed, as I believe this one is likely to end up happening, it usually means that I'm a little bit more mixed to negative about the book, where maybe there's some redeeming qualities, but there's a lot of things that kind of hold it back and make it hard to recommend. Today's review is actually going to be a book that I do recommend, a book that I did enjoy quite a bit, but I'm probably going to sound a bit mixed on because of my personal experience with it. That is, as you probably saw in the title and thumbnail, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Without spoiling much of the review itself, let's just go ahead and jump into the good of the book as I see it. Some of the things that I definitely enjoyed with no drawbacks or anything along those lines. The first thing that I've got to say is that I really enjoyed the pace and the readability of the book. It's kind of unreal how quickly this thing reads compared to what I was expecting. My previous Dickens read, the only other Charles Dickens book that I've read up to this point, was actually a collection of various Christmas writings. As you might expect, one of those Christmas writings was A Christmas Carol, and the other one of particular note was another novella by the title of The Haunted Man and the Ghost's Bargain. Those two stories I really enjoyed for what they were. There were some things that maybe held one or both of them back to some small degree, but I still really enjoyed both of them for the most part, and really liked them. But the main thing that I remember from reading those two novellas especially was that they were a little bit difficult to actually break through in terms of the writing itself, and also certain aspects of the storytelling made it a little bit difficult to actually read. Not necessarily hard in the complex sense, but just in the sense that it's a little bit more of an archaic version of English and therefore a little bit a slower reading, not necessarily hard per se, just you kind of have to think about it while you're reading it a little bit more. But notably different than that, A Tale of Two Cities actually read super quickly and super easily. Things move in the story at a pretty rapid pace, even if there's not a whole lot of active plot development stuff happening through a pretty significant chunk of the book, and we'll talk about that a little bit more a little bit later. There's a quick pace to it. I would not say that this book reads slowly at all. In fact, I was very surprised by how quickly I found myself making my way through it for basically the entirety of the book. Furthermore, I believe once you are connected to various of the main player characters within the book, their actions and their motivations quickly come to hit a little bit close to home. They feel very real, very organic, and very human, and I appreciated that aspect of the story. Particularly in the final third of the book, the last act, I guess you could say, we see outright quality of characters rather than just kind of people that you're following along as they're kind of living a part of their lives. You're getting some real unique and intricate actual character motivations that are really interesting and dynamic. I enjoyed that quite a bit. Even in certain places where you might not expect for some of that to come through, it starts to come through, especially in that final act as everything's coming together. I was even surprised by some certain story decisions within the book as a result of this as well, including a sort of romance light arc that appears in the middle of the book that was quite well done, and also, like I said, unexpected. I didn't think that that was going to be a thing in this book, and it was, and it's part of what makes certain moments in the finale, I guess you could say, hit pretty hard. Speaking of the finale more specifically, the way that I have been up to this point, I would say that the entire last third of this is very engaging. The French Revolution section. There's a ton of ups and downs to it all in terms of the mood and the hopefulness of certain different scenarios. There's a lot of back and forth between how are we going to get out of this situation now. There's really great and enjoyable moments sprinkled throughout the entirety of the last, you could say, part 3 of the book, and the last couple of chapters of part 2 make up essentially the French Revolution segment of the book, and I thought that all of that was really engaging, really good, definitely worth reading the book for alone. And just like what everybody basically advertised to me was yeah, this book, is a little bit slow going, but in the end it all comes together and it's super worth it. I would agree with that sentiment because the Revolution section is really good. Another positive, which is going to be a little bit more specific to my edition, is that the endnotes of this book are actually pretty good. They're sometimes they edge towards a little bit of semi-spoilery content or pretty much spoiling something that's about to happen, like in the next sentence or next paragraph, depending on where they're located at a couple of times. But it's not, super big deal really in the grand scheme of things. There's also a lengthy introduction, which I haven't read yet, but more specifically, there's multiple appendixes, including like part 3 of the appendix, which goes into a lot of like some of the things that Dickens was researching and looking into while he was writing the book, discussion on his influences in a lot of regards, which I also haven't read yet. I haven't read the appendixes yet, but they seem to be pretty in-depth and lengthy. This copy adds like not quite 100 pages, but basically 100 pages just in endnotes and appendixes alone. So definitely maybe worth checking out the Penguin Classics version of the book for that reason. Those endnotes are pretty good when they're actually like commentating on certain contexts of what Dickens was writing, when he was writing, and what certain things he may or may not have actually known about and taken influence by. There's some good stuff in the endnotes, so I recommend that in this edition specifically. Overall, I would say they mostly saved my confusion of the book. But speaking of confusion is where we're going to shift a little bit more into the bad of A Tale of Two Cities, and that is basically just that this book is a pretty dense one. It is short and quick. It's only 400 pages, and like I said, it reads quickly. So for Dickens, that's, pretty abnormal, I would say, for him, at least in my limited experience. It's a good thing that it is pretty short and quick, but a lot of the time of the book is spent just as setup. To a certain degree, you could maybe even argue that it's a bit too much or a bit excessive, and I wouldn't necessarily be inclined to argue with somebody who brought up that criticism of the book. It just quite simply takes a lot of time to do all of the setup that it is doing. In some sense, it is basically a slow burn. Still establishes arguably too much for its current runtime. Arguably, I say specifically because it took me personally basically until the last act of the book for me to really know, how to distinguish all of the secondary characters, aside from just the name being different, being like actually remembering all of the characters. It's not that they're unmemorable or that they don't really serve any purpose. It's that there's a lot of setup, and as I said, it's kind of like a slow burn. You could argue that A Tale of Two Cities is a slow burn, so there's just a lot that you have to understand. Like, is very front heavy in terms of the learning curve, I would say. The first act is basic setup of stuff, like kind of like getting you into the world in the first place. The second act is various arcs of character familiarity, trying to get you into all of their heads and understanding who they all are to a strong enough degree that all of their roles in the final act actually matter, actually have an impact, and actually work all together cohesively. And the book does really exceed at that. But if you're not prepared for this to be a slow burn, you're going to read like half of this book and wonder like what you're even really doing with it, because you're not entirely sure where it's going or what specifically the book is trying to do up to that point. And it takes a bit for it to hit the French Revolution section, where I think that a lot of the book is about commentating on the French Revolution to some degree. That is a large chunk of what it is doing, in my view anyway. So it takes a long time to get there, but it is totally worth getting to that point. My main criticism of this personally, in my personal reading experience at least, is that the book is arguably just a bit too short. I think it's a little bit too short for how much it is trying to cover at the same time. It has a lot of background. So if we're covering like any specific, just any given classic book, a lot of them will have like endnotes and stuff like that, in just the same vein that this book does. But a lot of them like have more or less one dedicated like setting, and even if that setting is across a whole country or something like that, you have like one setting, you have one set of context that you need in like endnotes to be able to clarify. Say like Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, who a lot of that book is about specific portions of England, and the endnotes clarify some of the context of a lot of that specific location. A Tale of Two Cities is a little bit different in that it has, for being such a short book, it covers like two distinct settings in multiple ways. It's a tale of two cities after all. It is covering London, it is covering Paris, it is covering, as a result, England more broadly, contextually, and certain aspects of France more broadly, contextually. So the endnotes have to tackle with both of these things at the same time. And you also have effectively two different sets of characters, and you're kind of like jumping back and forth between them. So some of the context and whether you're in Paris or in London in any given chapter sometimes gets a little bit unwieldy to follow. It's not too bad, but with how fast the book reads, sometimes it gets a little confusing. Like I said, it takes a little while to get your bearings, and then definitely takes a while to actually grow your familiarity with everything so that you're not just completely confused. Which kind of brings us into the ugly, which is basically, speaking from my personal experience, that I think I'm going to have to reread A Tale of Two Cities at some point in the future, which is not necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. I want to reread this. In fact, part of me wants to reread it pretty soon because, you know, I know what I'm getting into this time. And it's not even necessarily that I know what I'm getting into, and more that like I feel like I'm a little bit more prepared for being able to dive into some of this. I'm a little bit more familiar with some of the things that I was confused about initially, and so I'd be able to get a lot more out of, say, the early stages of the book, just as an example. But overall, I want to read Dickens's work, I would say, in a chronological, or rather a publishing order, and I want to do them in a sort of serial or semi-serial reading fashion with note-taking and like deep reading, trying to work through them a little bit more slowly, where this book is very easy to blaze through. I want to be able to like take this one through a little bit slowly when I reread it. I enjoyed the book, but I do want to reread it like in turn with, you know, all the rest of the Dickens novels. So kind of go back and start from the beginning and then get to this in its due place with a sort of system in place for how to experience Dickens from my own personal view, because I know that I missed a lot with this book. Like there's a lot of things that I missed, and I could read like the appendix and get some a little bit more context. I could read the introduction as well, and I think I will read all of that stuff when I reread A Tale of Two Cities at some point in the future. The ugly is that my experience of this is very heavily colored just by the fact that it was a lot, and I don't feel like I got the full experience. Like I did get the full experience. I read the whole book, but there's a lot that I know that I missed, and that kind of makes it a little bit difficult to say that like I loved this. You know, I probably came off a little bit more mixed in this review, but I did really like the book. The verdict is that I did really like it, and for the recommendation, I do actually recommend the book. The third act especially is very solid, sorry, and it is obvious why people hype this book up so much. It just, I think I wasn't in the right time when I read it, so even though I enjoyed it, I don't think I enjoyed it as much as I should have. So I rated this 4 stars. I think on a reread I'll definitely give this 5 stars. It is of that quality, but it was a lot, and I don't think I was necessarily prepared for it to be as much as it was, even though I went into this knowing that it was going to be a lot. It's kind of one of those weird situations. That's why I talked about that so much in The Ugly. But again, this is a weird recommendation because I do recommend A Tale of Two Cities to you. Evidently, the build-up and the payoff of it is satisfactory to a lot of people. That's what makes a lot of people recommend it. Is like, oh yeah, just kind of like push through the beginning. It's a little bit slower. It takes a long time to really get on its feet. That is true. But that last act, the last act of the book, is really good. Like super, super solid, and definitely worth picking the book up for. Like, that alone, basically. If you understand going into it that it is effectively a slow burn book, that you have to like build your investment in it as you read, you should be totally fine with it. And again, I was totally fine with it. I just want to reread it so I can appreciate it even more than I did this first time. And again, the book was super readable, quick prose, surprisingly enough. So it's not necessarily you have to push through some difficult reading to get through. No, like it actually reads pretty easy as well. So I definitely recommend this one. A Tale of Two Cities is officially my first Dickens novel that I've read. We'll see when I can eventually circle around to reading some more of his stuff later. I have some plans for that, but, well, some of that's probably going to end up being a long time coming, so we'll discuss that at some time in the future, an indeterminate time in the future. I feel like I got to get some of my website stuff actually taken care of, which I haven't for a very long time at this point, before I feel like I am really ready to tackle what it is that I would like to do with Dickens, but we'll see if that ever comes to fruition, because it could very well not. But thank you for watching this video. If you did, I really appreciate it. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.